Snow had begun to fall in wide, tired flakes the night Caleb Carter felt his clarity slipping away. It was Christmas Eve, yet his heart carried a weight that had nothing to do with winter. Out on his quiet stretch of farmland, the wide, curved path leading to the barn shone faintly under the moon, a silver reminder of the purpose he'd been trying so hard to protect. But tonight, that purpose was being tested. A storm had passed through earlier, leaving fences strained, doors half open, and animals restless. Caleb moved with a lantern in hand, a symbol of the discipline he'd relied on his entire life. Yet even its warm glow felt small against the confusion rising inside him. The wind shifted, sudden and cold, brushing against his coat like a warning or a whisper he wasn't ready to hear. Out by the old oak tree, his grandfather's tree of legacy and stability, a figure had been seen earlier that afternoon, too close to the fence line, too curious about Caleb's belongings. Tools had gone missing, feed sacks had been disturbed, footprints trailed off toward the road. And now, with Christmas hours away, Caleb had discovered something worse. A young neighbor boy, shivering inside the barn, clutching the very tools reported missing across the valley. Fear in his eyes, shame on his hands, poverty in every part of him. It was a moment steeped in direction, leadership, character, inner strength, and the uncomfortable truth that the richest Christmases often demand the hardest forms of integrity. The barn was still. The boy trembled, and Caleb felt the heavy fracture between justice and compassion, a moral test he had long avoided. But it didn't start there. We must go back a little in time. Before we dive deeper, make sure you subscribe. If stories of purpose, clarity, and inner strength speak to your soul, then this is your place. Hit subscribe so you never miss the wisdom waiting in the next chapter. Long before that cold Christmas Eve, Caleb Carter lived by a rhythm as steady as the ticking clock in his grandparents' old farmhouse. Each morning before sunrise, when the world was quiet and the mist still wrapped the fields like a soft, unanswered question, he walked the wide, curved path leading from his porch to the barn. The path had seen decades of boots, seasons, storms, and prayers. It carried history, but more importantly, it carried direction. The farm sat on a gentle rise in the valley, with the horizon glowing with light whenever dawn finally broke. Caleb always paused at that moment. It wasn't ritual, it was alignment, a grounding in purpose, clarity, and intentional living. The kind that his father used to say kept a man from drifting too far from the values that mattered most. And it was there, between the soft lowing of cattle and the rustle of cold wind weaving through the trees, that Caleb practiced the habit that shaped his character: quiet gratitude. No dramatic display, just a nod of humility, a brief, quiet prayer, and a reminder that integrity was the one harvest that demanded the most consistency. The old oak tree stood tall near the fence line, a monument of legacy, stability, and long-term vision. Caleb often touched its bark on his way to mend fences or carry feed, a small gesture of respect for the generations that had poured sweat and discipline into this land. The oak witnessed everything: victories, losses, storms, reconciliations. It had also witnessed the slow unraveling of hardship across the valley. In late autumn, he began noticing things that didn't fit the usual order of farm life. A missing rope one week, a half-emptied bag of seed the next. Footprints where no one should have walked. Nothing catastrophic, just small disturbances, enough to unsettle the focus he worked so hard to maintain. Folks in town had their theories. Some pointed fingers at drifters. Others whispered about teenagers testing boundaries, but Caleb sensed something different, something quieter, more complicated. One morning, while checking the back pasture, he found a tin cup left near the creek, not rusted, not old, freshly used. Then he noticed the animals' behavior, the horses lifting their heads with alertness, not fear but cautious curiosity. Animals, he always believed, felt the moral weather long before people did. Still, Caleb kept working, fences to mend, soil to turn, winter preparations to complete. Leadership, he had learned, wasn't loud, it was daily stewardship, even when uncertainty lingered. By early December, winter pressed in. Frost thickened on the fence line, and the farmhouse heater groaned with age. Families filled town shops, preparing for Christmas, while the valley worked to stretch every dollar. Caleb noticed neighbors struggling more than usual. Jobs had been lost. Prices had climbed. Some homes ran on hope more than resources, and that was when he first saw the boy, thin coat, eyes lowered, hands stuffed deep into his pockets. He lingered near the Carter barn one late afternoon, then disappeared into the tree line when Caleb called out. Nothing about him felt threatening, just misplaced. Lost, maybe hungry. Caleb mentioned it to a few folks at the feed store, but no one claimed to know the child. Rumors rose quickly, families moving from town to town, a father recently arrested, a mother ill, a trailer without heat. Nothing verified, but everything hinted at quiet suffering. As the days passed, the disturbances on Caleb's farm grew just slightly more obvious. A latch left open, a lantern moved from its usual hook, a bag of oats reduced by a few scoops, enough to irritate a man, enough to test his discipline and emotional maturity, enough to stir questions about whether someone was exploiting his kindness or simply surviving. The wind began shifting earlier in the month, carrying the bite of storms rolling in from the mountains. Snow was promised. Hard nights were coming. Caleb took longer walks along the fence line, feeling the tension between compassion and boundaries, between generosity and responsibility. The moral test was forming, even if he didn't see its full shape yet. The valley prepared for Christmas with lights, carols, and hurried errands. But under it all, beneath the snow-heavy clouds and half-packed porches, Caleb felt something deeper stirring, a call for wisdom, integrity, and discernment. Caleb Carter had never dreamed of wealth, not the kind measured in bank accounts or new machinery. His dream was quieter, steadier, shaped by purpose, clarity, and the long arcs of intentional living. What he longed for more than anything was to preserve a place where people, especially the young, could remember what character felt like. A farm where the sound of boots on wooden floors meant belonging, where the wide curved path taught direction long before a father could teach it with words. Every Christmas season, that dream sharpened. Maybe it was the way the horizon glowed with light a little longer in winter mornings, or maybe it was the hush that settled over the pastures after snowfall, stillness that mirrored the soul's quiet need for focus. But in those moments, Caleb felt a deep conviction that God had entrusted him with more than land. He had been given a responsibility for people too. He often imagined restoring the old bunkhouse that once housed farmhands in his grandfather's era. In his long-term vision, it could become a refuge for young men who'd lost their footing, boys without mentors, teens drifting toward trouble, kids who needed steadiness more than sermons. A place for character building, rooted in work, honesty, and a sense of belonging. He pictured tools on the walls, a warm stove, simple meals, and mornings filled with the lessons that only soil, sweat, and quiet prayer can teach. But it was a dream he carried privately. Caleb understood stewardship, and he refused to start anything prematurely. Divine timing matters more than ambition, his grandfather used to say. And so Caleb waited, sharpened his discipline, and tended the land with consistency, believing that clarity comes when a man walks faithfully, not when he rushes. One evening in mid-December, before the events that would unravel into a moral test, Caleb sat on the porch after finishing repairs on the barn roof. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, but the stars were sharp with beauty. His gloves lay beside him, still dusted with sawdust. A single lantern flickered on the porch rail, its glow steady, a reminder of the inner strength he relied upon when days grew heavy. He bowed his head, not in dramatic devotion, but in honest reflection. A quiet prayer, a moment of humility. He asked for wisdom to lead well, for discernment when trials would come, for the resilience to hold integrity even when convenience whispered otherwise, and perhaps, though he didn't say it aloud, for a chance to make a difference in the life of someone who needed direction. When he lifted his eyes, the mist that had gathered earlier began to lift, unveiling the full sweep of the valley. It was a small, silent breakthrough, a gentle insight, but it steadied him. The simple Christmas ahead, he believed, would carry its own richness if he stayed faithful to his purpose. He didn't know then that his dream, his integrity, and his leadership would soon be called into question by a boy with cold hands, a frightened heart, and a desperation that walked the line between wrongdoing and survival. But the soil of Caleb's character had already been prepared. The test was coming, and his purpose would decide the outcome. The first trial did not arrive with thunder, nor with the dramatic crack of a broken fence. It came quietly, like most internal battles do, slipping into Caleb's life through small frustrations, lingering questions, and a slow erosion of clarity. By the week before Christmas, winter had settled heavily on the valley. The cold was sharper than usual, and the mornings demanded more discipline just to keep the animals warm and the pipes from freezing. Caleb rose before dawn, as always, but something inside him felt different, less steady, less focused. The wide, curved path to the barn, which usually gave him a sense of direction, now felt longer, heavier beneath his boots. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Tired in that deeper way a man becomes when his purpose feels tested not by events, but by doubt. The disturbances around the farm, missing tools, open latches, strange footprints, had begun to wear on him. He prided himself on being a man of integrity, a leader in quiet ways, someone who offered stability to others. But now, even the animals sensed his unease. The horses watched him with alert eyes, the cattle huddled closer together, the dogs lingered near the porch as if waiting for reassurance he could no longer give. On one especially cold morning, he stepped outside to find the barn door slightly ajar again. Only a hair, but enough. Enough to tell him someone had been there during the night. He tightened his coat, lifted his lantern, the symbol of his discipline, and walked slowly inside. The air was cold enough for his breath to hang thick. Something in his chest tightened. It wasn't fear, it was the feeling of being intruded upon, the unsettling sense that the order he had built with consistency and long-term vision was being chipped away. And that was when the internal questions began. Why me? Why now? How do I stay compassionate without becoming naive? What is the right boundary? Leadership, he knew, wasn't just about offering help. It was about knowing when help strengthened a soul and when it enabled a weakness. That distinction required wisdom he suddenly felt he lacked. He walked back to the house slower than usual, his breath fogging in the bitter wind. The old oak tree stood firm as always, a symbol of stability, but tonight even it seemed distant. Caleb paused beside it, placing his gloved hand on the bark, hoping its grounded presence might restore a sliver of direction. But the wind shifted hard, cold, and unfamiliar, as if urging him to prepare for something larger than missing tools, a warning, a coming trial. By midday, tensions grew worse. The heater in the farmhouse sputtered, the water troughs froze solid. The soil near the fence line hardened like stone. Every little difficulty seemed to gather weight, pressing on him, demanding emotional maturity he felt slipping. When he sat at the kitchen table for lunch, he stared at his untouched plate. He knew exhaustion when it came from work, but this was different, an exhaustion born from uncertainty. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Lord, Give me clarity, he whispered. But the prayer felt thin, swallowed by the stillness of the room. He didn't want to judge whoever was taking from him, but he also didn't want to be foolish. He didn't want to punish a struggling soul, but he also didn't want to invite danger onto the land he protected. It was a moral knot, tight, uncomfortable, stubborn. That evening, as he fed the cattle, a subtle sound broke his focus. The faint crunch of steps in the snow near the tree line. He turned quickly. Nothing, only shadows stretching long across the pasture. "Show yourself if you need help," he called out. But the wind answered instead, carrying his voice toward the distant hills. Hours later, after chores were done and tools put away, the internal tension finally broke through, not outwardly, but inside his chest like a quiet storm. He knew he had been given a life of stewardship, a farm, a reputation for fairness, a calling to offer direction to the lost. But how could he do that when he felt blind to the truth? As he walked the fence line one last time that night, snow began to fall again, soft but relentless. The mist thickened around him, muting the world, blurring edges, stealing visibility. It mirrored his soul perfectly. For the first time in years, Caleb felt unsure of who he was in a moment of pressure. The path at his feet faded. The lantern in his hand flickered. His sense of clarity wavered. The internal trial had arrived fully, a test of patience, a test of wisdom, a test of character. And though he didn't know it yet, it was preparing him for a far greater confrontation, the one that would expose the true nature of the stranger creeping across his land. The moral test had begun, and the storm inside him was only the beginning. The second trial did not give Caleb the courtesy of arriving quietly. It came with accusation, suspicion, and the kind of injustice that forces a man to choose between reaction and leadership. 3 days before Christmas, as the valley braced for another storm, Caleb drove into town for feed supplies. The sky was low and heavy, the wind restless. One of those days when even the animals sensed the shift, standing alert near the fence line. Caleb parked his truck outside Miller's Feed and Grain and stepped inside, shaking off snow. Men gathered near the counter, speaking in tense, low tones. When they saw Caleb, the room tightened. "There he is," muttered Hank Dobson, a man known more for clever schemes than character. Hank pushed his hat back, leaned on the counter, and eyed Caleb as if he'd been waiting. Caleb nodded politely. "Afternoon, Hank." Hank didn't smile. "Heard you've been having things go missing out your way." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "A few tools, nothing major." "Funny," Hank replied, crossing his arms, "because the sheriff's been hearing about other things gone missing too, and all the footprints folks been seeing seem to head toward your place." Several heads turned. Caleb felt the sting of injustice rise, slow and sharp. "Footprints leading to my place, or away from it?" he asked calmly. Hank shrugged with exaggerated innocence. "Hard to say. Snow covers a lot, but people talk, Caleb. They say you might be hiding someone out there, someone trouble." The accusation hung like a sour fog between them. Caleb inhaled carefully, discipline steadying his voice. "I don't hide lawbreakers," he said. "Never have, never will." The men exchanged glances. Some believed him, some clearly didn't. Hank took a slow, taunting step forward. "Maybe you don't hide them. Maybe you protect them. Always knew you were soft-hearted." But soft-hearted can turn into soft-headed real fast. The injustice stung deeper this time, not because Caleb cared what Hank thought, but because Hank's words planted seeds, insecurity, distrust, fear. These seeds spread quickly in a rural town when winter was harsh and wallets were thin. Caleb paid for his feed and walked out with steady posture, though his insides churned. As he loaded the sacks into his truck, Hank followed him out. "You watch yourself," Hank said, lowering his voice. "If someone's stealing from you, the law should handle it. But if you're harboring somebody, that's a different story. Caleb turned sharply. I'm harboring no one. Hank smirked. We'll see. That smirk stayed with him the entire drive home, gnawing at his focus, shaking his earlier calm. Snow thickened. Wind pushed hard across the fields, bending the frozen grass. Caleb's mind carried questions he didn't want. Had the boy taken from others? Was he running from something bigger than hunger? Was Caleb enabling wrongdoing by not reporting the disturbances? But another voice rose quietly, his grandfather's voice, full of integrity. Don't you ever let other men's fear decide your character. Still, tension built. Leadership often meant standing alone, and the isolation was beginning to weigh on him. Caleb awoke to the dogs barking sharply. He stepped onto the porch and saw two figures at his fence line, Sheriff Langford and Hank Dobson. The sheriff held a clipboard. Hank held self-satisfaction like a trophy. Caleb walked out calmly, though the weight in his chest grew heavier with each step. "Morning, Caleb," the sheriff said, voice firm but not unkind. "We've had more reports of theft, multiple properties. The tracks lead through this area." Hank jumped in quickly. "Told you, he's got someone hiding out here." Caleb ignored him. "Sheriff, I've had disturbances, yes, but I haven't seen the person responsible." That was true, until the night he would find the boy in the barn. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. The sheriff scanned the property. "Mind if we take a look around? Just routine?" Caleb hesitated, not from guilt, but from principle. His farm was his responsibility, his stewardship. But refusing would feed Hank's narrative. Allowing it risked exposing something he hadn't yet understood. He stepped aside. "Go ahead." They walked the barns, sheds, and fence lines. Hank exaggerated every small disturbance. "Look here, Sheriff. This latch is loose. This track seems fresh. This tool's out of place," painted Caleb as negligent or worse. By the time they finished, the injustice had deepened into something heavier, a quiet insult to his integrity. The sheriff handed him a notice. "Just keep an eye out, and Caleb, if someone comes to you for help, you tell me. Times are tough. Desperation makes folks dangerous." Hank added, "And some people help criminals without knowing it, or without wanting to admit it." Caleb met his eyes with steady strength. Character outlasts cleverness. Hank always has. The sheriff left. Hank lingered a moment longer, then walked away wearing the smile of a man who believed he'd planted enough suspicion to get results. Caleb watched him disappear down the road, feeling the storm outside merge with the storm within. Snow began falling again, thick, relentless. The mist lifted briefly, revealing the distant hills before swallowing them again. The landscape mirrored his own emotional fog. He walked slowly to the barn, thinking of the boy he'd seen near the pastures days earlier, thinking of the missing tools, thinking of the moral crossroads tightening around him. Was he being naive, or was he being called to a deeper form of stewardship, one that required resilience, strategic thinking, and inner strength? As he reached the barn door, a sudden gust, an icy shift of wind, cut across his face. It felt like a warning, a turning point, a signal that the next moments would test every part of his character. Little did he know, the child behind the thefts, the injustice Hank exploited, and the moral test God had allowed was already inside his barn, cold, frightened, holding stolen tools, and trembling beneath the weight of his own decisions. The true confrontation was minutes away, and so was the beginning of transformation for them both. The storm arrived in full force the morning Hank Dobson's schemes finally unraveled. Snow whipped across the valley, bending the fence line and blurring the fields into a white haze. Caleb had barely slept after finding the boy, Eli, curled in the barn with the stolen tools. Their conversation had been quiet, halting, fragile. Eli wasn't a criminal. He was a scared 14-year-old trying to keep his mother and little sister warm in an abandoned trailer with no heat and no food. Caleb had wrapped him in a blanket, fed him, and listened, not as a judge, but as a man determined to lead with integrity and emotional maturity. Eli's voice shook when he explained that someone had told him which farms wouldn't notice missing supplies. Someone who promised to pay him a few dollars for anything he brought. That someone, Eli admitted tearfully, was Hank Dobson. Caleb felt the revelation land with clarity, not the kind that bursts with anger, but the kind that settles with calm purpose. Eli hadn't acted from malice. He'd acted from hunger, manipulation, and fear. The injustice wasn't the boy's doing. It was the fruit of a grown man's selfishness. Still, Caleb didn't rush. Strategic thinking mattered now more than emotion. He let Eli sleep in the warm loft while he tended to the animals and prayed quietly for wisdom. A man must guard his reactions if he hopes to guard his character. By midday, the sheriff's truck struggled up the long road, tires spinning in deepening snow. Caleb had called him, not to accuse, but to tell the truth. Integrity requires light, not secrecy. Inside the barn, with hay dust swirling and the storm rattling the windows, Eli repeated his story. His voice shook, but his honesty held firm. The sheriff listened with growing concern. When Eli finished, the sheriff nodded slowly. "This lines up with other reports," he said. "Hank's been stirring fear to cover his own tracks." The truth was out, not through vengeance, but through clarity. That afternoon, the sheriff confronted Hank Dobson. It didn't take long. Men who build their lives on manipulation rarely stand long under scrutiny. Neighbors came forward, recalling Hank's strange questions, his eagerness to blame, his insistence that Caleb was hiding someone. One farmer produced an old tool Hank had tried to sell him. Another remembered Hank scouting around the back road late at night. The storm of truth gathered quickly, and Hank's cleverness collapsed beneath its weight. He was fined, issued a formal warning, and publicly exposed for exploiting a child's desperation for his own gain. There was no dramatic spectacle, just the steady, inevitable fall that meets every unjust man who mistakes cunning for character. Meanwhile, the town learned the truth about Caleb. The whispers faded. Respect returned, and though he sought no praise, his integrity shone even brighter because it had been tested under pressure. That evening, as the storm eased and the horizon softened under a pale glow, Eli approached Caleb with hesitant eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." Caleb rested a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Character isn't measured by mistakes," he said gently. "It's measured by what you do after them." The injustice had passed. The unjust man had fallen, not by Caleb's revenge, but by the natural consequence of his own choices, and now a deeper transformation was ready to begin. The day after Hank's fall, the valley woke under a sky brushed with pale gold. The storm had exhausted itself overnight, leaving the world blanketed in white, quiet, humbled, reset. Caleb stepped onto the porch before sunrise, breathing in the cold air as if it carried a fresh promise. The horizon glowed with light, warmer than it had in weeks, the kind of glow that speaks of clarity returning after long confusion. Eli was still asleep in the bunkhouse, wrapped in quilts Caleb's grandmother had sewn decades earlier. For the first time in months, the boy was resting without fear. Caleb stood still, hands in his coat pockets, letting gratitude rise quietly inside him. Leadership, he knew, wasn't proven in calm weather. It was forged in storms, internal and external, and he felt a deep sense of purpose settling more firmly into his bones. As he walked the wide, curved path toward the barn, something remarkable happened. A sudden wind shift swept across the valley, gentle yet undeniable, brushing his face with a warmth that didn't belong to winter. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried meaning, subtle, divine, unmistakable, a whisper of divine timing. Caleb paused, lantern in hand, and looked across the snow-covered fields. The world felt aligned again, as if God had pulled back the curtain of confusion and shown that every step, every doubt, every trial was leading here. God never arrives late. Inside the barn, the animals were calm, standing with an alert peacefulness that made Caleb smile. Even animals sensed when a storm, of weather or life, had passed. He finished feeding them, then headed to check the fence line. Eli appeared moments later, bundled in an oversized coat Caleb had found in storage. "Morning," the boy said softly, eyes still unsure whether he belonged. "You hungry?" Caleb asked. Eli nodded. They walked back toward the house, boots crunching in fresh snow. Caleb could feel the boy's fear lingering, not fear of the farm, but fear of the future. The kind of fear that grows in children who've never had stability, boundaries, or someone willing to show them a new direction. Inside, over a simple breakfast, they talked. Not about Hank, not about the sheriff, about Eli's mother, his sister, his dreams buried under survival. Caleb listened the way a wise man listens, without rushing, without judgment, with emotional maturity and a heart grounded in stewardship. At one point, Eli looked down at his plate and whispered, "I don't know what kind of person I am anymore." Caleb leaned forward, voice steady. "You're becoming the kind of person who tells the truth when it's hard. That's the beginning of transformation." The boy swallowed hard. Later that afternoon, Caleb hitched the truck and drove Eli back to the old trailer where his family was staying. What he found tightened his chest. A mother pale with exhaustion, a little sister wrapped in 2 coats, a heater that barely produced warmth. Poverty stood in the doorway like a silent witness. Caleb stepped inside, the cold still lingering in the air. "You all shouldn't be in this alone," he said gently. Eli's mother's eyes filled. "We didn't want trouble. We just didn't have anything left." Caleb nodded. He understood. Life had ways of bending people into corners they never chose. What happened next felt less like a decision and more like obedience to a calling that had been whispering to him for years. "We'll get you through winter," he said. "You can stay in the bunkhouse, warm beds, hot meals, work for dignity, not charity." Eli's mother covered her mouth with her hand. His little sister's eyes brightened. Eli himself stood straighter, shoulders lifting as if someone had just placed hope back into his life. On the drive back to the farm, Caleb felt something stir deep in his chest. A breakthrough, the confirmation of his long-held dream. The bunkhouse, the mentorship, the refuge, it wasn't meant for someday. It was meant for now. Divine timing had chosen Christmas. When they pulled onto the property, the sun dipped low, turning the entire valley into a sweep of glowing gold. The oak tree stood strong. The fence line cut a clean, symbolic boundary across the snow. And in the pasture, a young horse that had been limping for weeks stood tall again. Steady, calm, restored, a sign, a blessing, a confirmation. Caleb exhaled slowly, deeply, gratefully. "God never arrives late," he whispered. The boy heard him. And for the first time in his life, Eli believed it. In the quiet days that followed Christmas, the valley spoke softly of redemption, not through grand celebrations or costly gifts, but through small acts of integrity, renewed purpose, and the steady return of clarity. Caleb worked alongside Eli with patience, teaching him how to mend a fence, stack wood, and walk the land with discipline instead of fear. Each task became a lesson in character building, each quiet moment a seed of spiritual growth. Winter continued, but its cold no longer carried despair. There was warmth now, warmth born not from wealth, but from compassion guided by boundaries, leadership grounded in wisdom, and the deep understanding that simple acts done with sincerity can reshape a life. The valley would remember this Christmas not as the year of thefts, nor the year of storms, but as the season a boy found direction, a mother found stability, and a man's long-held dream awakened at the exact moment divine timing allowed it. And so, the story leaves us with a timeless moral. Leadership begins the moment a man chooses integrity. Those who plant in faith harvest clarity. Often, God strengthens a man before he blesses him. The richest Christmas, after all, is the one that transforms the heart. In the end, Caleb learned that the richest Christmas isn't made of ornaments or noise. It's made of clarity, purpose, and the courage to choose integrity when no one is watching. Maybe that's the invitation for you today, to slow down, breathe, and ask where God is strengthening your inner direction for the season ahead. If this story touched something in you, some quiet place longing for stability, wisdom, or transformation, then let this be your moment of breakthrough. And if you believe God never arrives late, type it boldly in the comments, "I trust God's timing." Now, don't stop here. There's another story waiting for you, one that deepens this journey even further. Tap the video on your screen and keep walking the path with us.